Welcome everyone to our webinar on how to promote gender equality in the management and staff of MFIs. We'll just give another 2 minutes for our colleagues to join us, and then we'll begin. Okay, it's the top of the hour, so we're going to begin. Thank you all for joining us for this third webinar in the series on how to promote gender equality among the management and staff of microfinance institutions. We have a great session lined up for you today. My name is Kara Forster. I work with SPTF, and I'm going to just briefly go over the agenda and introduce our panelists to you. And for those of you who might not have joined us for the previous webinars in this session, this series of webinars on human resources topics is jointly hosted by the European Microfinance Platform and the International Labor Organization's Social Finance Unit. And these webinars are a product of the priorities that were identified in the survey that e-MFP's Human Resources Action Group worked on last year. So at the end of this presentation, I have a series of additional resources where you can find out more about these topics. That includes the e-MFP's Human Resources Action Group webpage, the report that summarizes the survey of almost 200 microfinance institutions, kind of a landscape level review of human resources practices in the sector, as well as more information on gender equality. So without further ado, I would like to introduce your panelists for today. We have with us Susana Martinez Restrepo, who is originally from Colombia, but now based in the United States. She previously worked with the UN on topics of gender, and she is now the executive director and founder of Core Women, which is a company that helps support institutions that are trying to implement these practices on gender equality. And for our Voices from the Field section, we have with us today two people from Friendship Bridge, Caitlin Scott, who is the Chief Strategy Officer for Friendship Bridge. She's based in the United States, and Victor Contreras, who is their Director of People Services and who is based in Guatemala, where they have their microfinance operations. And so they will be sharing with us the practices that they have actually implemented over the last couple of years to achieve the excellent gender equality practices that are represented in both management and staff. So I wanted to also just mention that the Universal Standards for Social and Environmental Performance Management have been revised this year to include more information on gender equality and how to ensure strong social performance management on that topic. So we have a whole section on responsible human resources management, and that is another place where you can find out more information on how to implement these kind of practices. So now I would like to turn it over to Susana for her presentation on the work of Core Women.
Thank you. Cara, thank you so much for the invitation. I'm gonna share my screen. Let me see, okay. Okay, so if we have questions, we can write them in the chat, and we're gonna have also the opportunity to have some questions at the end of the presentation. I also have to apologize because I have to leave a little earlier the workshop, but we'll have time to have this presentation and also for questions. So as Cara was saying, my name is Susana Martinez Restrepo. I'm originally from Colombia. I lived in the US since 2008 when I came to do my PhD in economics of education. I consider myself a feminist economist, and a lot of what we do in Core Woman responds to that. So is gender equality and women's economic empowerment, but also look through an economic lens, a lot of measurement, a lot of thinking all the time about cost benefit, efficiency, and like economists think about things. So about Core Woman is an innovation, is an innovation lab for women's economic empowerment and gender equality. We do applied research, capacity building programs for governments, corporations, foundations, and training specifically designed to address the barriers that women face. We work mostly in Latin America. Also, we have projects in the United States. We are starting to increase our presence in Europe and Africa. Europe more through international cooperation agencies, but the implementation in Latin America and in Africa. And we have offices in New York City, Bogota, and Lima. This is where Core Woman is registered. And then you see a team, a picture of part of the team, and also some idea of where we implement our projects. Some of our areas of expertise include labor markets. So for example, women entrepreneurs that we're gonna be talking today in some of the examples that we're gonna give you about our work, gender gaps and barriers for women to access labor markets of finance, male-dominated sectors, women in value chains. We also have work in education, the care economy, gender-based violence. Gender-based violence also very focused on the relationship between economic empowerment and gender-based violence, gender lens investing, financial inclusion, gender and climate change, and gender equality in organizations, which is also one of the topics we're gonna talk today. These are, as I was saying, we do applied research, capacity strengthening, and training. So this is some example of our applied research. Some in English, some in Spanish. So for example, we have been publishing since 2017 the State of Women-Owned Business Report. It was a report published every year, and now sponsored by American Express, and now it's gonna have some methodological changes and will be sponsored by Wells Fargo in the US. Another example is Hispanic Women Entrepreneurs, Understanding Diversity Among Hispanic Women Entrepreneurs. This was funded by the federal government, the National Women's Business Council. And another example, this is part of our own series and our own research initiative to understand the state of women-owned businesses in Colombia, which also includes information about accessing finance. We also have a spin-off startup, which is called CW Tech, that allows us to scale up our impact. CW Tech is a digital education company that works to scale gender equality and women's economic empowerment. Our platform allows us to measure, automate, and strengthen the technical and social-emotional skills of women and men, but with a gender focus. And we focus a lot on women entrepreneurs. So there's a lot of courses, for example, on financial inclusion, so on and so forth, access to credit, but we also focus on the gender equality within organizations. So there's courses for women in leadership, negotiating salaries, gender equality within organizations, and so on and so forth. So now I'm gonna get a little bit more into the meat of our work, and I hope you have ideas of good practices and things that you can do in your organizations. So something really, really important is that we aligned most of our work when it comes to capacity strengthening and training on a methodology, Core Women's methodology. And we looked at three aspects: structural aspects, bias and behaviors, and barriers. I apologize because there's some capitalizations missing, but I have been working on a UK project, and my capitalization right now is crazy because in the UK, they don't use the same capitalization that in the US. So my brain is a little bit confused right now. So basically we look at structural aspects, bias and behaviors, and internal barriers, which is what does it mean? When we look at structural aspects, when it comes, for example, to a financial institution, since this is one of the topics that we're be covering here, we think about the norms, the protocols, the policies, the written norms and policies that make part of the organization. So for example, if I have a policy of recruiting without biases and fair recruiting men and women, I am not, for example, discriminating against women in the kind of requirements I have, or I have in my values and my mission, and have like, we value gender and diversity, and we want people from different ethnic background. That could be structural aspects that we have our written policy norms, protocols. It can be also sexual harassment policies and protocols. So that's what we consider within an institution structural aspects. So let's think about more like the macro, the regulatory, the policies. The second one is bias and behaviors, and bias and behaviors of people within the organization. So not, as you might know, and I guess there's a lot of people from human talent and human resources here, I can have all the policies I want, but people might behave very differently to what the policy says. This is part of the culture, right? But bias and behaviors can affect women's opportunities, because even though I have a policy that says we value gender equality and diversity in our organization, and maybe I have a protocol on how to do interviews to recruit women and men without biases, maybe the behaviors of the people that are part of the organization are not that as nice as what the document says. So bias and behaviors is more the culture, not the written culture, but what people are doing, their bias and behaviors. We all have behaviors. We cannot deny that we all have behaviors, but they can be different biases against certain ethnic groups, against certain gender groups, but we all have biases. So a lot of what comes to the structural aspect is also not only to have the right policies and norms, but also the right procedures to help to ensure that those biases are not going to affect women's opportunities, either internally or externally. We're going to talk about these internal and external. Internally could be more women in leadership positions. Externally could be women getting access to credits and microloans. So these bias and behaviors can be seen in many ways. It can be that I am discriminating women to get a promotion. It can be that I am, for example, allocating tasks to women that are more called housekeeping. There are a lot of studies about that men are more likely to get tasks that are more promotable. So for example, hey, Mary, you're going to do my PowerPoint, and hey, Jeff, you're going to do my strategic planning and present to my partner. So Jeff is going to get more likelihood, more chances to get promoted because he's more exposed to clients, to strategic meetings, while Mary is doing a PowerPoint because women stereotypically do better PowerPoint. So that's an example of a bias or a behavior. It can be microaggressions. Women, hi Mary, can you please serve me a coffee? Hey Jeff, can you please help me present the first part of my presentation? That could also affect significantly women's opportunities. And it is part of bias or behaviors of individuals, regardless of what the norms and policies say that what we value in the organization. In terms of recruiting, it can be, for example, that of course we have there's a bias that male leaders are more assertive. So when looking for a leader, my bias and my stereotypes, either from HR or either from the leaders of the organization, are gonna prefer male, not because they're necessarily better, but because they seem more assertive. And the evidence shows that actually that may be even that that image of assertiveness could even be negative for the organization in many ways. So that's what we mean about bias and behaviors. One thing is the norm, what is written, and another thing is how people in the organization or certain key individuals behave. And the third one, and it's really, really important because it is often forgotten, is internal barriers. So I can have the best written policies, I can have a very positive culture towards women because of the process of the socialization process that we have lived along our lives, face internal barriers that can affect our self-confidence, the way we communicate, the way we express ideas, the way we negotiate. And organizations need to understand where those internal barriers are so that they can benefit from the existing, if there's existing opportunities of the organization. So to summarize, in Core Woman methodology and the work we do with the organizations, we look at the world in these three areas, and this is going to structure our analysis, our measurement, our recommendations. Social norms, which are key to understand what's going on with women at any level, for us affect everything. A social norm can affect the way we write a policy and the words we use. It can affect the bias and behaviors because our stereotypes respond to social norms, and internal barriers because if I don't have the self-confidence to tell my boss, please promote me, it can be because my mother and my grandmother told me, don't ask, don't be loud, women need to be submissive. So social norms affect every single dimension of this methodology. So how does it work? We have, for example, we work with an organization and we have an initial meeting to understand their needs. We do interviews and survey to employees. And it's very important to have the survey to employees because the interviews, we look mainly at the structural aspect. So we interview someone from HR, some of the leaders, and they will tell us, for example, yes, our norms regarding gender equality in promotion practices is really clear. This is the norm, we are committed. But then when we go to survey the employees, and we're going to see some indicators, there's a gap often between what human resources thinks they're doing and what employees perceive it is being done and what their opportunities are. And these gaps sometimes respond to reality, not always. It could be lack of communication. It could be that someone is new and doesn't know anything, but sometimes respond to the reality that having a norm in purple doesn't mean people are behaving in the right way. So that's why we have to look at the different dimensions. So we do the interviews mostly to HR and leaders of the organizations. We survey employees. Normally we try to get to 70-80%, and we do an analysis to understand if there's key missing observations in certain areas. So for example, if we have all the mid-level managers, but we don't have the entry level and we don't have the people in the field, that's very important to have everybody represented, because we can have a correlation between, for example, having more sexual harassment and not being in the main office. So we want everybody, we try to get at least 80%. We do also a document analysis, which is very time consuming, very interesting, because when in an interview, for example, an HR person tell us our gender, our sexual harassment protocols are awesome and we're responding to the local regulations, and we see and we have experts, super experts on these and the national regulations. They're going to see, well, yes, we're responding to the regulations, but you are not saying, for example, how people can access the support. What do they have to do? what mechanisms they have to get protected from retaliation from their bosses. So we do this document analysis, and that also help us to understand other problems that are not seen in the interviews, and also to give very key recommendations. Then we could design an action plan. That's very important because we don't want to become like consultants, like, okay, you have to do A, B, and C. So this is more like, okay, this is what we found, and I'm gonna find an example. We triangulate the different methods and what you want to prioritize. And these conversations are often with human talent, and they know, oh, my boss is never going to allow us to do A, let's go with B and C. There are other ways to prioritize, I'm going to show you. Normally, and depending on the budget and the commitment of the organization, we prioritize 3 to 5 actions, and we help them to implement them, but normally it's the organization that implements. We're just supporting the process, and this also ensures sustainability. And then we have a meeting for lessons learned. This is an example. Cara asked me to give concrete examples, and I couldn't translate to English every single indicator, but this is an example, for example, of some of the gaps that we can find between men and women. Let's see, for example, 71%, which is my internet is okay. For example, within structural aspects, we have percentage of people that perceive that their boss shows to be committed to gender equality. So for example, men perceive more commitment than women when it comes to gender equality, which is interesting. This is a statistically significant difference. When they're too close, for example, 52 and 64, that the difference is often not statistically significant, but this is, so that's what I'm suggesting it. For example, another one where we see gaps between men and women is the percentage of women that perceive that the organization provides equipment and comfortable equipment for women and men. This is an example from mining and energy sector. This is interesting because, for example, men perceive that they get less equipment than women. So in bias and behaviors, which is, let's remember the second one where we want to see how people are behaving. Look at this difference percentage of people with stereotypes of gender about the feminine. So we have in the survey some questions that allow to see whether they have stereotypes or not. So there's 10 or 15 questions that make up for this indicator, and women show to have more stereotype about the feminine than about men, which is really interesting because this shows that it's not necessarily men that are penalizing women in, for example, bias and behaviors, but women themselves can affect other women with their own stereotypes. And this means also that when we work about bias and behaviors, the work has to be done not with men, because the stereotypes and biases are within the entire organization. Another big difference is, for example, the percentage of individuals with stereotypes about the masculine. So we have more men than women, so it's the same, but in the other way. And okay, for example, this one, when two people in a couple work, men should be in charge of half of domestic duties and caring for children. So women agree on a higher percentage than men about these affirmations. So these are examples, some indicators that we have, and we disaggregated by men, women. Sometimes we can also disaggregate it depending on the organization. We can disaggregate it by hierarchy, so we can compare like entry level, admin office, mid-level managers, leadership, or within divisions. That's a very interesting way of analyze and also see maybe where are the problems. So I'm gonna go because I don't have a lot of time, but something really important, this is an example of how we present also the results in addition to the indicators, is that we present the results according to the type of instrument that we use. So sometimes, in this case, is microaggressions and discrimination. For example, in the interviews and document analysis, there's no information about the role or implications or anything about microaggressions and discrimination in the organization. Interviews and document analysis web tool is something we use. It's a UN Women and Inter-American Development Bank that sometimes we use, and there's no mentioning of microaggressions and discrimination and what they do. But in the survey with employees, we found that 37% of women report suffering from microaggressions frequently at work, and women perceive that most of the discrimination is mainly on wages and opportunities to be promoted. So this is why this methodology is so brilliant, because we can see, okay, in this case, for example, the organization had a clear policy to promote women and equal wages, but it seems that there's some problem here in bias and behaviors, and women are perceiving that they are not treated fairly. So sometimes it's just a perception, sometimes it's true, and it is important to see in the action plan why is that. So in the action plan, we consider different levels when we recommend our strategies. One thing is to have commitment towards something. Another one is to have written policies. So commitment could be more like a rhetoric commitment in social media, or it could be, you know, that the leaders are saying this in the media. It could be also that is within the values and mission of the organization, but it doesn't go beyond. So written policies is more, it is written in the policy. So if I have a recruitment policy, then the recruitment policy has specific guidelines or how to avoid bias. For example, some good practices for that is that a person is interviewed by 3 separate individuals in 3 separate moments. Those 3 individuals need to be from different genders and divisions so that their biases don't affect the person. Each question has to be graded after the first question. So I ask the question, the person respond, and I have a rubric 1 to 5, 1 to 10, where I put the number. I have to avoid getting out of the script. Why? Because my bias and behaviors as a person that has certain preferences is going to affect my likelihood to choose one person or another. An example, some years ago, I laughed, but it's funny, but it's sad also. I was interviewing some research assistants, and one of the research assistants came, and in his resume, he said, I do triathlons. And I was doing triathlons back then. And our interview started talking about triathlons. After 20 minutes, we were best friends. And anything he said about that, after that moment, I liked it, and he was a good research assistant, but I really think I hired him because of our connection. And that is called confirmation bias and affinity bias. I have an affinity towards someone because of the triathlon, and confirmation bias is that any single thing that he said after that was confirmation of the fact that I liked him. So that's why, for example, in written policies, we need to have very specific guidelines and protocols that avoid certain biases and situations to happen that affect gender equality. Implementation. So I can have the written policies, but if I don't implement them, nothing is going to happen. And there's many ways to implement. It's part of also communication. Am I communicating? A lot of the time we have found that there's an amazing gender-based violence protocol or sexual harassment protocol, but nobody knows it, and nobody knows the mechanisms to address, to communicate with HR, and they don't trust the system sometimes. So communicating, creating trust, and finally measurement and transparency, which is really, really important. What is happening with these, monitor over time. When we do the action plan, we look at the impact of the action. We look at the short and mid-run viability, and we look at the feasibility. Why is this so important? Because sometimes, for example, when we work with the mining sector, it's like, okay, what if we set ourselves a goal to have 30% or 40% of women leadership within the next 5 years. Well, I'm like, it's not going to happen because we need to have more women studying oil engineering. It's a program, for example, in Colombia. I don't know if it exists in the US. So for that to happen, we need to start with 10-year-olds, convince them that this is awesome, and we need to change so many things in the industry. So we can have that as a goal, but as an action plan, maybe the action plan is not to set that goal, but the action plan is to have some activities with girls in school so that they get interested on these type of jobs and occupations and professions that are traditionally male dominated. So that's why we look at the impact. We want to have some short and mid-run viability and impact. So, for example, communications. There are some nudges that can change behaviors in the short run. For example, if you want to promote equal pay, you need to be transparent about salaries. So you can start listing your salaries. You can have a range in the salaries. You can train if you want more women in high-level positions. You can have, for example, these recruiting practices to change, set some leadership fast-track options. So that's what I mean by impact and short and mid-run viability. And that is feasible, particularly because sometimes the leadership can be completely against, or because there's not budget, or because they are understaffed. Being understaffed is super common. So sometimes some initiatives take a lot of time and commitment and individuals, and some financial institutions, small financial institutions cannot do it all. So we look at that. Some examples of action plans. For example, we have unconscious bias activities, training, communications, nudges, and I say also activities because we are completely against that everything is solved with training, and I'm gonna go a little bit more on that on the recommendations. We have, for example, revision of internal policies, for example, gender-based violence, communications, manual strategies. And we also do deeper analysis of gender pay gaps, leadership gaps, reviewing hiring strategies. In gender pay gaps, something really interesting, I was listening to a podcast the other day, and there was an organization, a hospital in the US that wanted to do a lot of training to reduce the gender pay gap. And the consultant was like, no, let's do an analysis to see what the problem is. And he found that the problem is that the company cut like extra hours, and that they changed the turnos, how do you say, the scheduling, and the new scheduling was really affecting women because it was the time they had to pick up their kids. They did want to work more hours, but it was about the scheduling. So he found that, he proposed to change the schedule, and a gender gap that was 20% became 8%. And then they included some transparency measures so that women and men knew how much was paid for each position, and the gender pay gap disappeared. So that to say that sometimes things are not necessary, not everything is solved by training. It can be a deeper understanding and a data analysis of what's going on. It can be also reviewing hiring practices, hiring strategies. Where am I posting? How am I interviewing? So on and so forth. Some example of our training that includes, for example, gender bias. It can be very important about the internal and the external. We can focus on the internal, meaning how gender bias affects women's opportunities within the organization as employees to, for example, be promoted and be in leadership roles. But it can also be external. So my value as the organization, my loans, my credits, because the bias of the organization can affect women's opportunities to lead and be promoted, but also the chances that women get credits. So an example of the content would be gender gaps in access to credit, how to explain those gender gaps with the systemic approach, bias and behaviors within the financial institution that affect women's access to credit, internal barriers. For example, there's evidence, not super robust, but there's evidence about women being more risk adverse, and examples of good practices. In terms of strategies regarding bias and behaviors, we can have training using data and case studies, statistical analysis of borrowers' data, to demonstrate gaps and bias by comparing comparable applications. We are doing currently that in Banco Pichincha in Ecuador. It's super interesting. We also do behavioral experiments where we can have like little cases with randomly assigning women and men with certain categories. And it has been demonstrated that, for example, in a study of Chile, similar to what we're doing now, 18% of the gender gap on access to credit is explained by bias and behaviors of the individuals that approve the loans. And we can also do help with communication strategies that include nudges, marketing nudges. So I'm gonna go fast because over time. So some of the recommendations could be, first, measure everything. Second, understand where the problem is and consider it seems a systems approach. Could be our approach, or it could be a systems approach, something that you really need to understand that no barrier or no issue is explained just by one thing. Take action at different levels. Commitment, written policy, implementation, communications, and measurement. And very important, not everything is solved with training. Each barrier problem might require different actions or a combination of solutions, as I was explaining with the case of bias and behaviors and pay gap and procuring practices. Thank you.
Thank you, Susanna. That was very interesting. I really like the structure of the things that you look at. It reminds me very much of how we do the social audits around universal standards. And I think it's really important to look at all those, the policies, the interviews, and what you see in practice that may be different from, the policies and what people say that they're doing, because there's often that disconnect between what's on the paper, what people say, and then what they actually do. I'd like to welcome questions from the audience at this point. I see there are a few hands up. So Musa Moise, if you would like to say your question, you may do that now. And if your connection is, and Aida, if you have a question, you may unmute yourself and ask it now. If your connection is difficult and not allowing you to ask live, please put your questions in the Q&A chat box.
Well, while they get interested in asking questions. So about the audit, yeah, we tried not to say it's an audit, and it's not an audit. We're not an audit company, but it has been, we call a systemic approach, and it has been very, I think it's a very positive experience for everybody, because sometimes HR leaders have the best intentions, but they don't realize that maybe people are not perceiving what they wrote, or don't know it, or it's not well communicating. A lot of companies also have a lot of rotation, so you might do the best effort to communicate, but then after 6 months, 8 months, 20% of the people is new and they don't know. So it's really, really important to keep working on these areas, and these levels are very useful to understand, like, okay, I have the commitment, I have the written policy. How is the written policy really written, and how can we help you to improve? But because it's not only about telling you, oh, this is not good, but it's in the action plan, we actually help you. So people are saying that they don't know the policy and they don't trust the system, and they don't know what the mechanisms are. So let's improve these that you have, that is great, and let's explain better, and then work with communication so that everybody knows what we're doing. And I talk a lot about sexual harassment. It's one of the main topics we talk about. It's one of the main barriers for women to be in leadership positions. And sometimes, particularly in Latin America, in the US, this is more like in the DNA already, but in Latin America, sometimes it sounds obvious, but for many organizations, it's not obvious, and a lot of people don't trust the system. And microaggressions also, everybody in the US talks about microaggressions, like, yeah, microaggressions, of course. But I remember a presentation I had in a consulting and about microaggressions, and someone came, one of the big consulting, someone else said name, and someone, a female came like, oh, I can finally call by a name that bad feeling that I had, I didn't know what it was, but it's there. It's like little things that make you really annoyed and make you want to leave the organization and not apply to promotion. So at least in the global south, I think that a lot of these debates are just getting there. So that's very important.
That's interesting. And I really I related to what you said about how sometimes the biases are in the women themselves, because I remember when I was teaching school as part of my Peace Corps service in Nicaragua 20 years ago. And we were talking about, machismo, this chauvinism that is pervasive. And the female teachers I was working with said, we're the ones who perpetuate it because we're the ones who raised our sons. So if we raise them to think that way, then we're perpetuating the cycle. And so it really is something that begins, in childhood. And you said sometimes to fix the problem, you have to go talk to the 10-year-old girls about why they should major in oil engineering. And sometimes to get rid of those microaggressions, you have to go back to how do we raise our sons, and how do we raise our daughters. So it's definitely something that's, pervasive. And I think sometimes it can feel like a big problem, but I appreciate that you are giving concrete solutions about things we can do now, because we don't want to feel like, well, we can't fix it unless we wait a whole generation. There are concrete things we can do to make it better. And with that, I would like to transition to our colleagues at Friendship Bridge, who did have some concrete actions that they took to make things better. And I would like them to be able to tell us their story about how they worked on, very explicitly creating a workplace that was favorable for women staff, and of course women clients, because that is part of their mission. So let me turn the mic over to Caitlin Scott, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you, Kara, and thank you, Susanna, for that presentation. It was very interesting, and I think I'll highlight some of the same points in how we have implemented and thought about gender equality in our organization. I hope my slide is sharing. My name is Caitlin Scott. I am the Chief Strategy Officer in Friendship Bridge, and my colleague here is Victor Contreras. He's our Director of People Services in Friendship Bridge. Friendship Bridge, it has a mission to create opportunities to empower Guatemalan women to create a better life. We operate in Guatemala with a program of microcredit plus. So we provide group loans and individual loans to solely women, along with educational and entrepreneurial development services and preventive health services.
Caitlin, we're seeing the split screen.
Thank you.
Can you share the screen that has presentation mode? Sorry to interrupt.
I appreciate that. Is that better?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. So we've been operating in Guatemala for over 20 years, and we have today just over 25,000 clients in rural areas of Guatemala. Our social objectives are to create and improve resilience with our clients, to engender business development, as well as increase empowerment with our clients. And we do that by providing that dual delivery of financial services and non-financial services. On an annual basis, we conduct an evaluation through Great Place to Work. It is a process that evaluates different work practices and standards, both in a trust index and a cultural index, that allow us to look at different aspects of our organization along those policy lines, the practices lines, the perspectives of our staff, to identify areas of opportunity to improve the way that we operate and improve the trust and culture of our institutional culture of our organization. We are a learning organization, so we generally try to do evaluations on an annual basis of different aspects to always be learning. So as we're talking about gender equality, we have been learning over the years of what we can do better, and we continue to learn going forward. Since we are an organization dedicated to women and the empowerment of women with our clients, we know that we have to start at home. We cannot provide a high quality service that will create that impact without having that sort of focus within our own operations. We also know that if we have higher gender equality, that we have the ability to be more productive and generally improve both the lives of our clients as well as our staff. So that's part of the DNA, which in some ways makes it so we have to be even more diligent to know that we are including gender equality in what we are doing, and not just assuming because we serve women that we are gender inclusive in the way that we operate. Some challenges that we've identified over the years that we want to address and have addressed are the first item here, the gender sensitivity within our staff, topics that have already been touched on today. But Guatemala is actually one of the lowest gender equality countries in the world, as identified by the World Economic Forum. The gender gap is very high between men and women in education, in legal rights, in political representation, in labor force participation, but it has a very high entrepreneurial index, which allows our informal sector. And this means that our program works well, but there is a low level of understanding around gender dynamics within the context we work. So we know that we have to create awareness about gender inclusion. And as Kara mentioned earlier, machismo is a major dynamic within the Guatemalan culture, and that is propagated by both men and women. And so we work with our staff to raise awareness about some of our biases in gender equality. We also work to define our policies and procedures with an eye toward gender equality and what practices we put into place that and how those might affect men and women differently. We take those practices and policies and look at them both from how they affect our culture, but also we have a very strong values-driven organization. So we have a set of values that we use to evaluate our culture, to evaluate performance of all of the individuals within our organization, and those all have a gender perspective. In terms of participation of women and men in our labor force, we also look at the distribution or proportions of men and women in different levels of the organization, in different roles, and how we recruit our staff as well, thinking of gender as a lens there. We look at leadership in the organization, and we understand that decision-making has a huge influence on the organization, and we want to make sure that women have a seat at that table in managerial and executive positions. And finally, we do salary reviews and research every year to establish competitive salaries. We also evaluate the salaries that are and incentives we are paying our staff and establish policies around what are the salaries by position rather than by other conditions that may be bias related. And we look at what are the labor conditions or working conditions of the different positions and how those may be favorable to women so that we can recruit and retain staff in those different positions. So I'll give some examples of what the practices are that we've put in place based upon those considerations and challenges. In the last few years, we have had a very strong focus on generating competencies and experience in staff, but particularly interested in creating growth opportunities for our female staff by encouraging them to gain or participate in trainings and apply for positions for promotion. And that has allowed us to have in the last year 55% of promotions going to women in the organization. Our recruitment process has a policy around, or has criteria of experience, competencies, et cetera, but it's very specific that that we look at the different criteria for different positions and try to understand if they are restricting female applicants and address those in appropriate manners. And we also try to have a balance of 50% male and female incoming staff, and we've achieved that rate. Institutional values, as I mentioned, we try to live our values, and we include in our annual performance evaluation process both a self-assessment and a peer assessment to see if people believe that they are living our values, which also reflect gender equality. And we have a disciplinary process, both policy and process for non-compliance or poor performance with those. We also have a Leaders in Action program where this is creating a career path and training. And we have a target of 50% participation by our female staff. We have branches around the country. And while some of those branches or some of those offices are more of administrative offices where some of the administrative staff should be assigned, we have reassigned staff to be closer to their home, to be able to work out of branch offices instead, so that they could be closer to home if they need to go home and work with their children in some sense at lunchtime, or attend to family matters, or men as well, for convenience and flexibility of work environment. We try to encourage an open door policy where people can communicate with leadership, and they know the appropriate channels and ways that they can express their concerns and complaints. We have an anonymous complaint line that allows staff to submit complaints and have a follow-through process outlined and clear for the organization. Our benefits are very favorable for women within the context we work. Women have a year of the ability to have an hour off to attend to their babies after they have delivered a newborn. They also, during maternity leave, receive 50% of their incentives for pay. We have medical insurance that cares for mothers both in maternity and newborn care. We have a program for loans for the purchase of motorcycles and driving lessons. We work within a very rural context, and our loan officers many years ago tended to be men because they were the only ones who could get to these very isolated communities because they knew how to ride motorcycles. And to address this, we decided to start a program to train women to drive motorcycles and the purchase of those motorcycles. We have a very generous vacation policy with flexibility to attend to family and personal matters in addition to those vacation days. And we encourage an institutional culture and team building through multiple activities, both for recognition and celebration of International Women's Day, an annual health event, a month-long health event to focus on personal care, and we encourage work-life balance. As a result of the implementation of all of these practices over the last, I would say, 8 years, we have seen an increase in job satisfaction as evidenced by the Great Place to Work evaluation that we do on an annual basis, which has also increased our staff retention rate. Today we have 82% staff retention rate, which is very high for our industry. We've seen productivity improvement and commitment to our mission by all of our staff, which has allowed us to build a very strong team. And as I mentioned, the promotions from within and the growth opportunities has created more commitment and the ability to grow as an organization and grow in new areas to work with new clients. We've also seen intergenerational change. We believe that the impact that we can have in empowerment is both for our staff as well as our clients. We have many staff members who have been with us for years and been able to send their children through college. We've even hired children of staff, and they're a new generation of Friendship Bridge employees. Those are the results that we've had, and that has allowed us this year to be received recognition by Great Place to Work, a new certification that is Great Place to Work for Women. We are first in the Latin American and Caribbean region in 2022 out of 30 participating multinational companies. That is my time. Are there any questions?
Sorry, I was talking on mute. There are a few questions coming in from the chat. So I see one that says, in the operational side, who motivates credit agents to offer loans to women? I guess for you all, it's all women. So in a way, that's
yeah, that's what I was saying. It's kind of in the DNA. We only offer loans, our programs, to women. So the targets that we set for our loan officers would be solely for women.
Yeah. Okay. And what risk indicators do you have about women's empowerment? I think that's more like, how do you measure the progress you're making on women's empowerment?
Some of the indicators that we evaluate for empowerment are related to self-efficacy and self-esteem, as well as agency. So their ability to participate in decisions about their businesses, their health, and what they do with the income from their businesses. We have not implemented a specific set of indicators like that for empowerment for our staff, but we use the Great Place to Work survey to look at that, the outcomes from that.
Okay, and then we have one that says, do you have any other examples of women-specific support? I'm fascinated by the idea of driving lessons and motorcycle loans. What other ideas came out of this process or other processes?
Victor, do you have any other examples you would like to share?
Sorry, it's other example for what? Sorry.
Like the motorcycle loans and training, do we have other examples of specifically supporting women?
I can say in Spanish, yeah?
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Okay.
And we'll translate.
Okay. El tema que usted mencionó de maternidad, en donde cuidamos a sus, con el seguro médico, es un tema interesante de soporte a las mujeres. También, bueno, la participación en las promociones internas. Son como esos ejemplos, Caitlin.
Okay, so he's saying that the examples of access to medical insurance for maternity care and maternity leave, as well as the internal promotions, are all many of the ideas that have come out of those, the ideas, brainstorming we've done about how to support women better. Another item that I didn't mention is that during maternity leave, we do assure the position for staff when they return, which is not very common within the Guatemalan context, nor is access to health insurance.
And then there's one that says, is there an assessment of gender, like an index like they have for Green Index? Not that I'm aware of, but I don't know, Caitlin, if you've come across anything in your research?
Well, for individual organizations, not so much, but what I mentioned, the global gender gap by the World Economic Forum is a gender index. And it has, like the Human Development Index, different indicators for different countries around the world.
Okay. All right, and here's one from a colleague in India. She says, how to address the norms or behaviors about gender, especially at the management level. Sometimes there's pushback from the CEO. They say they try to recruit women, but women do not want to work in microfinance.
Yeah, some statistics I forgot to mention. We have a ratio of 55 to 45 men and women within the organization, so 55% women, 45% men. I think that's actually specifically in our field operations. We have found that our female staff are more capable of serving our female clients, which are all of our clients. And so we've really tried to drive home, toward recruiting and retaining and training female staff within the field operations. And we've done this promotional plan to try and encourage and train staff, female staff in particular, to be promoted throughout the organization. Our management team is actually predominantly women. I think it's, I can't remember the percentage, but Victor, if you want to share, of more women than men, both in executive, managerial, and board positions. And I think that has really allowed us to create gender equality, both a result of a lot of our gender equality practices, as well as to continue to improve in that sense.
Mm-hmm. And then another question says, what specific tools or resources have you used? Is there any toolkit or guidance on gender analysis that has guided your implementation?
I'm not sure I could point to something, to one thing specifically, but as I mentioned, the Great Place to Work is a great resource for that. The SPI audit is also an excellent tool because it looks at the different, it looks at hundreds of indicators for performance management, and many of them are related to the gender dynamics, and we've used that many times over the years. But generally speaking, we try to stay informed about gender equality and gender issues because it is a key element of our mission and we generally participate in webinars like this one, and try to read like the gender gap indices reports, to just stay up on what is the best, what are the best practices.
Well, so thank you for mentioning the SPI audit tool. For those that may not be aware, the SPI audit tool is the audit tool that allows a microfinance organization to check its level of implementation of the universal standards, which I mentioned at the beginning of the webinar. And so there's definitely more information about that, and that's listed in the resources at the end of this presentation. And I see there's a question about where they can view the slides. So all of these, the recording, the presentations, and a summary of the conversation from today will be posted on the European Microfinance Platform's Human Resources Action Group webpage, which we are going to, which I think has been included in the chat box, and which is being posted again now. So that's the place to visit to find out more about these topics. And I think since we are now at 5 past the hour, I am going to close, but I'd like to take this opportunity to thank our participants for joining us, and thank you, Caitlin and Victor, for joining us today and sharing all of those experiences that Friendship Bridge has done. And I know it's a great award that's a culmination of a lot of, sort of faith and hard work over the years. And so congratulations to you all on that award, and thank you for sharing your journey with us.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Have a good night and a good morning, depending where you are on the world. Bye.